Hello, Robert Ross here, comedy historian, and I'm at long last doing my very own podcast. I must be the last person in the world not to have their own podcast. But obviously, because of the situation we all find ourselves in, and we're at home a lot more, I thought I might add a podcast to my ongoing mission to spread a bit of joy rather than misery. So here we are, and it's going to be called Robert Ross's Comedy Heroes, and I've got lots of those. So we'll do one of these every day or every other day or whenever we fancy it, basically. Yes, Comedy Heroes, and I'm joined on this little chat with my good lady, Miss Gemma Fanning, who will explain what's going on here.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is we're going to take in turn a different comedy hero of yours.
Mm-hmm.
And we thought we'd start this off by talking about Frankie Howerd, because that's how we met.
Oh, no, what? Such a face. No, Frank, it's my turn. Yeah, we met via Frankie Howerd. He's long been one of my absolute comedy heroes. I adore Frank. And yeah, we met at the Museum of Comedy, a venue in Bloomsbury in London, where I do lots of shows. And this particular show, I was in conversation with my good friend Geoffrey Holland.
Hi.
Hody ho, thank you. And the show, we did two shows that day. They're different shows with different clips, and it was called Geoffrey Holland's Comedy Heroes, Comedy Friends. And one of the people that Jeff worked with was Frankie Howerd. He understudied Frank in pantomime, and he eventually went on because Frank couldn't. He was unwell. So I let that story go, and I've got my own personal connection with Frankie Howerd. And I did say, I started saying the story, and I thought, no, it's not my show. This is Jeff's show, really. So I said, anybody wants to hear the end of this story, I'll be in the bar afterwards.
Enter me. And thus enter where we are today. So,
yeah.
Obviously, like probably a lot of people who kind of know Frankie Howerd in the mainstream, I knew him through Carry On and adored him in Carry On Up the Jungle and in Carry On Doctor. But just this week, we've been watching Up Pompeii.
Yeah, which sort of span off from Carry On. I mean, the pilot was in 1969, so Frank had made his last Carry On film appearance. They shot in 1969 and released in 1970. Carry On Up the Jungle, as you mentioned, and also that year he did the TV Christmas special. So that was the last Carry On connection, official Carry On connection. He did the first 1969 Christmas special, which was brilliant and hilarious. But Up Pompeii was written by Tara Rothwell, of course, who wrote those classic Carry Ons that you mentioned. So it was sort of like a small screen continuation. It's like sort of Carry On Cleo, really, Up Pompeii. But you'd not seen it before, had you? The TV?
No, I mean it's not something. I think I remember maybe in the 90s it being on, and I have this vivid memory of it being on TV, probably like New Year's Eve or Christmas Eve, and it was on. And I think as a child I didn't really connect with it.
I suppose because the one thing that has been repeated more than anything is the film version. There's a film version, and they did a trilogy, what I call the Up Trilogy, and preempting the system of Blackadder, they did different historical periods. So the first film was a spin-off about Pompeii. Lots of sitcoms of the 70s span off into big screen versions. So they did a film version of Pompeii, recast everybody but Frank, and then they did another one called Up the Chastity Belt, which featured the late great Roy Hudd as Nick the Pick. Which is sort of medieval, Crusaders sort of thing. And then they did the last one, Up the Front, which was the Great War, the First World War spoof with Frankie Howerd in it. So they did three of those films. So those were on TV a fair bit. But the actual TV shows have not been repeated for a long time. They are available. You can buy them on BBC DVD. So the whole set's
I think
there.
that's why I've not necessarily even seen them available, not for a very long time in the mainstream, unless you go and hunt for them. But something else you introduced me to was we both went on a cruise back in October, and you did your Forgotten Heroes show, but the Halloween version, and I never realised, was it a Hammer horror?
It wasn't Hammer, no. The House in Nightmare Park. It wasn't Forgotten. I did several shows. I do these cruises for anybody who pays me, basically, CMV and P&O and put like that. And I did a show. It was Halloween, as Jem says, and I do a show. I did do a Halloween version of Forgotten Heroes of Comedy, but I also did a thing called just comedy horror stuff. So that was Abbott Costello and and Mel Brooks' Young Frankenstein and all that. And this Frankie Howerd film, it looks like a Hammer horror, but it's not. It's called A House in Nightmare Park. And when I was a kid, it was the one with the snakes in it. It was on TV quite a lot, and when I was in sort of like probably 5, 6, 7, 8, whenever, my dad would let me stay up late and watch this thing. It's quite scary in parts, but it is funny as well. And it's like a lot of those comedy horrors. They brought in a proper horror actor to be in it as well. So Ray Milland, who, although he was a matinee idol and in the 40s and a Hollywood star and won an Oscar for The Lost Weekend and all that, he was on his uppers a bit in the early 1970s and was doing films like Frogs and The Two-Headed Man and these sort of crazy horror films. So he came back to England. He was Welsh originally. Came back to Britain to make this film with Frankie Howerd, and it's brilliant. It's a sort of spooky house comedy thriller. And it's available on network DVD. So there you go. You can buy that, and on Blu-ray and DVD now.
And another now connection. It's funny when you become aware of something, you suddenly start seeing things all the time. And I think we're going to do another podcast on Marty Feldman, who I didn't know about until I met Rob. But you have this lovely, gorgeous poster, which I think you put on Instagram or Facebook the other day, of Jumping for Joy, which has just been on just this week on Talking Pictures TV.
Talking Pictures TV, the national service that Sarah Cronin and her husband and father provide for all of us to enjoy. Yes, absolutely. Jumping for Joy was quite a rarity, really, and it's a beautiful poster that I bought years and years ago, which I have. And you'll probably better spot it on one of the companion pieces. We're doing a little filmed thing as well during this mad crisis, and I might pose by that this afternoon if you have a look later on that episode. But yeah, Jumping for Joy is good. And I think people forget how big a star Frankie was in those early days. I mean, he was a lot like a lot of those comedians like Peter Sellers and Spike Milligan and Tony Hancock, and John Pertwee, they'd served during the Second World War and came and demobbed and came back, and Frank was in the army. But he was a huge radio star. He had this wonderful, even back then in the late 40s, this bumbling sort of style, and these wonderful shaggy dog stories that Eric Sykes would write for him. So he had all this, all that stuff, all that was scripted into the scripts, all that sort of bumbling style was scripted in. But he made a handful of films in the mid 1950s, star vehicles. The first one was a thing called The Runaway Bus, which was written and directed by Val Guest, and Frank would always joke it was made so cheaply because they had a coach and they stuck it in the fog. It's a bit like the sort of Ghost Train, the Arnold Ridley Ghost Train, and Frank's the hero, and it's a great cast. Tudor Clark's in it, and Terence Alexander, and Belinda Lee, and Margaret Rutherford, and it's wonderful. And Frank's the star, and there's a great scene when he's trying to make a phone call, which he basically ad-libs for like 2 minutes, because I think Val Guest said, we're underrunning here, we need to put something in, so Frank could just ad-lib that. And Jumping for Joy was the same sort of era, when he was the star of this film. It's a sort of like a greyhound racing sort of romp. It's really funny, and as Jen mentioned, it's just, I think this week popped up on Talking Pictures TV, and they will repeat that. So if you go to their Twitter or their Facebook page, I'm sure they'll flag up the next repeat. It's worth watching.
So what inspired you? Because you wrote a book about Frankie.
I did. Thank you, Doug. Thanks for that. I did. The Complete Frankie Howerd. What inspired the book, or
yeah?
I just love him. And I was asked, but that was published by Reynolds and Hearn. Actually, Val Guest and his wife Fiona Donlan wrote the foreword for that. 2001, I think. So it was Richard Reynolds and Marcus Hearn, my publishers, on that one. And it was one of those glorious days. I went round to Richard's house, my publisher, and the first person to publish me, actually, B.T. Batsford's. Richard worked at B.T. Batsford's, and he was the one that commissioned me to do, or sign me up to publish the Karen Companion, so I'm indebted to Richard Reynolds my entire life. So thank you, Richard. But yeah, he went off and did his own publishing house, himself and Marcus Hearn, and they asked me to write 2 books for them, one on Frankie Howerd and one on Sid James. So I said I could do that. Thank you. That's probably my 2 absolute comedy heroes. So there you go. Yeah.
So how did you start your research for a book? Because it's always interesting learning how writers begin with research, essentially. So
yeah, I mean, that's my favourite bit of it. I think you just go to newspaper libraries, or you go to Colindale, which has loads of newspapers there, and on Microfiche, Radio Times and TV Times listings. This is well before the Gnome, the BBC Gnome with all those listings online now. You had to go and do all the hard graft, which I just loved. And then I know it's awful. It's the worst job ever. You have to sit down and watch a lot of comedy and just look at it and put it into some sort of context. And the one about Frankie Howerd, I did quite a lot of reference books. That was a reference book, so it's broken down into radio and film and TV and stage. And you just meet people who he worked with, and you get interview footage from them. And it was basically a love letter to Frankie Howerd, really, because I'm not one of those writers that tries to sort of dig deep in terms of scandal and those sort of stuff. I mean, obviously Frank's life was peppered with all sorts of madnesses and infidelities and whatever, but that's not my business and nobody's business. I mean, the fact that he was an absolute comic titan, and I adore his comedy, so it was a sort of celebration of that. And I loved it. I loved doing that. I was, as I say, 2001, I think that was published. Yeah.
How did Frankie get started in the business?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, he was born in York in 1917, and as I say, he joined the army. He wanted to be a straight actor, but he had a very bad stutter, so he couldn't sort of do his serious stuff. And I think that's why he started doing that on the pauses and stuff to make the stutter almost work for his comedy, and it gave him this unique style. So he would do camp concerts, emphasis on the word camp, and as I say, once he was demobbed, he just would work the halls, music halls and variety theatres, and just worked his way up the bill. And he was brilliant. I mean, I saw him live many times in the early 90s. Just before he died, when he was he called us his Frankie Pankies, but he was still doing the same routines, 40 years on, really. It was the same sort of shaggy dog stories and innuendo jokes and things, and he was just brilliant. But that was it. I mean, I think on radio, if you listen to those, they're available, snippets of Variety Bandbox and those radio broadcasts. He's almost fully formed. He's this just great comedy personality, and there's only a handful of those people. I mean, you can think of people like Tommy Cooper and Eric Morecambe and Tony Hancock. They're just indefatigably just them, and nobody else can be what they are. They are just brilliant. And Frank is still. If I feel blue, I stick a Frankie Howerd film on. He cheers me up.
Well, to come kind of full circle, so going back to the fact that I know him, and probably a lot of people, their first experience of seeing him on TV is from Carry On. Yeah. How did he end up in the Carry Ons?
Well, that's another good question. I mean, his up and down roller coaster career. I mean, he had so many comebacks, Frank. It was ridiculous. He would give up the business and sort of, I'll give it another 5 months and I'll go and run a pub somewhere or something. And by the early 1960s, he was finished, really. He was doing. It's a film I sort of love. He did a film called The Cool Mikado, which is a early Michael Winner film with Mike and Bernie Winters and Tommy Cooper and Dennis Price, and it's nuts. It's a 60s sort of version of The Mikado, Gilbert and Sullivan opera, and Frank's in that, and he's really at the end of his tether, really. And that was sort of 1962. And then he did the revelation of the turning point was when he was invited to do That Was a Week That Was, satirical David Frost show. And Ned Sherrin was writing for it, and he did this monologue about the government and about and he went on and did this beautiful sort of Mickey take of the whole satire boom. The darlings of comedy were the Beyond the Fringe guys, Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, and Alan Bennett and Jonathan Miller. And he said, the four just men, or the four men just. So he was setting up the modern comics, and it was brilliant. And so suddenly the phone was ringing off the hook, and he got all these offers to do, his own BBC show, so written by Ray Galton and Alan Simpson. And off the back of that, he was offered the role in Carry On Doctor that Kenneth Williams had turned down. The lead part. It wasn't called Francis Bigger because it's called Francis because of Frankie Howerd, but it was that part. Kenneth sort of balked at the idea of having the lead part. He wasn't going to be in it at all, Kenneth, and then he came and agreed to play the little part of Dr. Tinkle. And there's moments. I mean, they do have scenes together. There was a weird thing where the producer And creator of the Carry-Ons, Peter Rogers, didn't want to put them in the same scene because he thought they might, cancel each other out in a weird sort of way. But because they're both sort of these colossuses of camp comedy, but they are in a few scenes together. But it works really well, and that was it. But it was a guest star thing. I mean, I was mentioning on the show I did on Sunday just gone. This is we're 20th of March today. And the Sunday at the Museum of Comedy, I did my Forgotten Heroes show, and Arthur Haynes. We played a bit of Arthur Haynes. And he did one of the Doctor films, the Betty Box, who was Peter Rogers' wife, and Rafe Thomas, who was the director, Gerald Thomas's brother. And Arthur Haynes did a film called Doctor in Clover. And that's the one thing you tend to see on TV of Arthur Haynes now. And Frank did Carry On Doctor, which is a sort of an affectionate sort of homage to the Doctor comedies. Even they've got a portrait of James Robinson Justice, who played Sir Lancelot Spratt in the we'll cut that bit. What are we? 50 minutes in. There's a portrait of James Robinson Justice, who played Sir Lancelot Spratt in the Doctor films, between the lifts in Carry On Doctor, as a little sort of nod to those films. So it was really Peter Rogers celebrating his wife's comedies. And Frank, in the middle of this, was just brilliant. I mean, he wasn't really an actor, he was a comedian, but he could act, and he could act his own comedy persona. So to stick him into that well-established gang of Charles Hawtrey and Joan Sims and Hattie Jakes and Sid James, it was just brilliant. And I love Carry On Doctor. But he wasn't going to join the team. It was sort of not quite a one-off, but he was there. And he sort of had a thing with Peter Rogers loved him at that time. I think they must have had some sort of disagreement, because Peter Rogers said he was like friendly moss. He grew on one, Frankie. And they had a sort of an agreement that maybe every 2 years he'd come back and do one. So it was 1967 they shot Carry On Doctor. At the end of 67, release for 68, and the end of 69 they shot Up the Jungle for an early release in 1970. And there's a lovely letter from Frank after they wrapped on Carry On Up the Jungle in the archives, just saying, I look forward to seeing you in October 1971. But that would have been Carry On Matron, and he wasn't obviously in Carry On Matron. So, and there was another letter somewhere, I think I put this in this book, so in a book somewhere, so this is not off the record, where they were casting one of the Carry On Christmas shows, and Peter Rogers actually makes a note saying, do not cast Frankie Howerd. And I don't know why that was, but whether he just felt he took over that first Christmas special. He does it brilliantly. I mean, he plays two parts. He plays this very glam sort of Mae West-like fairy godmother in it, and also the poet Robert Browning. And there's a bit when he first appears down the chimney and he loses his wig, and he ad-libs it basically. I mean, it's just hilarious. And Hattie Jakes is sat on the settee just watching him for like 5 minutes, not getting a word in. It's just pure Frank. And this is why Up Pompeii works so well for me, because it's his live act, that the prologue and all that, straight down the lens to the camera. He's playing to the audience of millions at home as well as the studio audience. And that's why he's so good in Up Pompeii. That was his playground, really.
I think it's interesting now you've just put it into perspective that he was only in 2 Carry-Ons plus the Christmas. Yet I kind of, you associate him with that.
Very strong personality. Absolutely, yes. I mean, I think, but that's the blessing and the curse of the Carry-Ons as well. I mean, Leslie Phillips only did 3 in the early days and then came back for Columbus and did 4. Forever known as a Carry-On person, and Frankie Howerd is definitely. And he flirted around with other stuff. There was talk. We'll get to this, Jem, when we're on our watch of Up Pompeii, because there were a few sort of revivals of Up Pompeii, and the last one was in 1990 for ITV called Further Up Pompeii. And I remember because I saw Frank a lot around that time on stage, and there was talk about them doing something called Carry On Pompeii. They were going to get Barbara Windsor and Joan Sims in to do like either a TV special or a film. So he was talking about that. There's a thing called Carry On Up Your Cinders, back to Ned Sherrin again, which was a Loose Ends Christmas special, which wasn't official, but Frank's in that with Barbara Windsor and Arthur Smith and Julian Clary. And then finally, when they were casting Carry On Columbus in early 1992, they originally offered the role of the King of Spain, which was eventually played by Leslie Phillips. They offered that to Frank to play. and Jim Dale, who was obviously based in New York and was coming back to Pinewood to do the Carry On, rehearsed those scenes with the King of Spain rather, with Frankie Howerd in mind. And then Frank obviously became ill and subsequently died, so they had to recast. And I remember Tesla Bars telling me, Frankie's agent, gently phoning Gerald Thomas and saying, even before he died, I'd recast if I was you. But that would have been lovely. And that's the weird, because Frankie was the only one of those old comedians, the original Carry On cast, who really had that respect of the youngsters. He was almost like in both camps, because although he was an original member of the Carry On actors and the Carry On film team, he also was really current. In the early 90s, he was so cool again. He was cool. He'd come out on stage in this crumpled suit and the wig and just be hilarious. So yeah. So that was it, really. That was he went out on a high. He was doing a series called Frankie's On ... where they filmed all these live recordings, live comedy routines. So he went out on a high, but bless him, he was 75 and still a genius.
Well, thank you very much for your insight into Frankie Howerd.
Should we end up? We'll do a quick, as people are at home and nothing to do probably, or they've got a lot more spare time. I thought what we'd do a little link to something that is easily accessible on the internet. So having talked about all his live stuff, and when I saw him many times on stage, Lyric Hammersmith and all over, there's a show that was released on sell-through VHS in 1991 called Frankie Howerd at his Tittermost, and that's in its entirety on YouTube. So I'll ask Gemma if you can make a link, darling, to that from this recording. Obviously, it'd be lovely if you look at my website, robertross.co.uk. You can order the book, The Complete Frankie Howerd, to read up on his entire career. And if you want to buy something for a treat, why not get, I know what we're watching now. We're watching a thing called the Frankie Howerd Collection, which is on BBC DVD, which includes every episode of the BBC Up Pompeii, including the 1975 revival, also called Further Up Pompeii, which is a BBC one, along with a thing called The Best of Frankie Howerd, which is bits from chat shows and live performances, and also a missing series, in a way, inverted commas, called Then Churchill Said to Me, which was shelved in the early 80s because of the Falklands War, and is a sort of Second World War Up Pompeii. So that's a thing to buy. But in the meantime, until the next time, this has been Robert Ross.
And I'm Gemma Fanning.
And this is Robert Ross.